You know that feeling, trying to keep up with just everything, all the news, the updates. It can feel pretty overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes. How do you actually process it all?
Right. So how do we cut through that noise, get to what's really going on?
Well, one way is to focus in. Like really look closely at the actual sources, not just the headlines.
That's where the real insights are, yeah.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're taking a deep dive into the current state of affairs, roughly 100 days into President Trump's second term. We've got this really interesting mix of info you shared.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. There's that recent AP NORC poll, which tells us a lot about public sentiment right now.
And then there's a detailed analysis of his revised tax plan. That's from the Tax Policy Center, the Urban Institute, and Brookings collaboration.
Right. And to get the bigger picture, we're looking at other stuff too, some historical context from the White House Historical Association.
Different perspectives from places like the Miller Center, Pew Research.
Insights on media from Rutgers. The ACLU's take on potential immigration policy.
Forbes on financials, Wikipedia for some legal background, even the BBC on U.S.-Russia ties. It's quite a range.
It is. Polls, economic analysis, history, media, legal, financial, international.
So our mission really is to pull all this together, dig into these sources, and give you a clear, concise understanding of what they tell us about President Trump's second term so far.
Yeah, looking at public feeling, potential economic impacts, and any kind of shifts in the broader landscape.
Okay, let's dive in. Where should we start? Maybe with that public perception piece, the 100-day mark.
Sounds good. The AP NORC poll is probably the best starting point there. And the main takeaway, it seems like for most people, these first few months are pretty much what they expected.
Really? So not a lot of big surprises. That's interesting in itself.
Kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
given how polarizing things can be. But let's look at the numbers. Approval-wise, about 31% view the presidency as good or great so far.
Okay, 31%. But what about the flip side?
Well, about half have a negative view. The overall favorability rating is around 39%. But 58% say they have an unfavorable opinion.
So more unfavorable than favorable. And I assume that breaks down along party lines.
Oh, definitely. Very sharply. The poll shows 84% of Democrats think Trump's doing a poor or terrible job.
84%. Wow.
And on the other side, 68% of Republicans think he's doing a good or great job.
Okay, so huge disagreement on performance. But you said people felt it met expectations.
Yeah, that's the striking thing. Despite the disagreement, most partisans, like 8 in 10 Republicans, 7 in 10 Democrats, they say things are proceeding about as they expected.
That really jumps out. They expected this level of performance, whether they view it positively or negatively.
Exactly. But where they really split, again, is on priorities.
Mm.
Are they the right priorities?
Okay. What did the poll find there?
Nearly twice as many people. 44% feel he's focusing on the wrong things. Only 25% think he's got the right priorities.
And I'm guessing partisan split again.
You guessed it. Half of Republicans feel the priorities are correct. But for Democrats, only 7%. And just 9% of independents agree with the priorities. Big gaps there.
What about specific issues? Does the poll highlight anything?
It mentions immigration continues to be seen as one of his stronger policy areas. Higher approval there compared to trade or the economy, for instance.
That's been a consistent theme. Any mention of other key figures?
Yeah, they asked about Vice President J.D. Vance, about a third approve of him. And Secretary of HHS, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., about 4 in 10 approve.
And I imagine those numbers also show partisan divides.
The pattern continues there, too.
So stepping back, the big question, direction of the country. How are people feeling overall?
Mostly pessimistic, unfortunately. 62% feel the country is headed in the wrong direction. Only 37% think it's on the right track.
62% wrong direction. That's a solid majority.
It is. And Democrats are most likely to feel that way. 87% say wrong direction. Republicans, though, are largely positive. 69% think the country is headed the right way.
It really brings us back to where we started, with those expectations. Didn't the poll mention pre-inauguration views?
It did. Before he took office, 37% expected a good or great presidency, 46% poor or terrible, and 17% just average.
So the current views, they kind of map onto those initial predictions for a lot of people.
Seems that way, yeah. Expectations matching reality, for better or worse, depending on your view.
Okay, so that's the public mood snapshot.
Correct.
Now, let's switch gears. The revised tax plan. This sounds like it could have some major impacts. What did the Tax Policy Center find?
Major is right. Their projections are, Well, pretty dramatic. They estimate a $6.2 trillion reduction in federal revenue just over the first 10 years.
6.2 trillion.
Trillion with a T, yeah. And then another $8.9 trillion in the second decade. These are massive numbers we're talking about.
Oh, wow. Okay. And less revenue usually means more debt.
Exactly. When you add in the estimated interest costs on that borrowing, the TPC analysis projects the federal debt would climb by $7.2 trillion in the first decade.
And over the longer term.
It balloons to an estimated $20.9 trillion increase by 2036.
20.9 trillion by 2036. Just staggering figures. So what are the specific changes driving this? Let's start with individual taxes.
Okay, so on the individual side, the plan seems to aim for simplification. It would consolidate a lot of deductions into bigger standard deductions. $15,000 for single filers, $30,000 for joint.
So simpler filing for many, maybe.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
But it also involves reducing the number of tax brackets to just 3. 12%, 25%, and 33%.
3 brackets. What else changes for individuals?
Well, things like the head of household filing status and personal exemptions, those would likely be repealed.
Okay, that's significant.
Also, the individual alternative minimum tax, the AMT, and the net investment income tax, they'd go away too. But there'd be a cap on itemized deductions.
A cap. How much?
$100,000 for single filers, $200,000 for joint. And importantly, the preferential rates for capital gains and dividends, those seem set to stay.
Which tend to benefit higher earners more, correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
Yeah.
Now, moving to the business side.
Right. Always a key focus. What's proposed there?
A reduction in the corporate tax rate, though the exact rate wasn't specified in the material we looked at. But a big thing is allowing businesses, including pass-throughs.
Like sole proprietorships, partnerships?
Exactly. Allowing them to choose to be taxed at a flat rate of 15%.
15% flat rate option. Interesting. What about investments?
Businesses could immediately deduct the cost of investments, that's called expensing, but the flip side is they wouldn't be able to deduct interest expenses anymore.
Ah, so trade-off there. Encouraging equity financing over debt, perhaps.
Could be part of the goal. Also, the corporate AMT would be repealed, along with some other specific business tax breaks.
What about things like estate taxes? Always controversial.
The plan proposes eliminating both estate and gift taxes entirely.
Eliminated. Okay.
But there's a catch. Capital gains on assets above a pretty large exemption, they'd be taxed at the time of death.
I see. So a shift in how inherited wealth might be taxed and things like childcare.
Yeah, there's mention of a new deduction for child-independent care, plus an increase in the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, and a new type of tax-favored savings account.
Okay, so it really touches almost every part of the tax code. What does the TPC say about the economic effects of all this, beyond just the revenue and debt numbers?
Well, they suggest it could provide some boosts. Lower marginal rates, the tax on your next dollar earned, might incentivize people to work, save, and invest more.
If interest rates stay stable.
Right, that's a key assumption. Lower taxes on new investments could make the U.S. more attractive for capital, potentially leading to, better productivity, maybe higher wages down the line.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Especially with that massive borrowing.
Exactly. The big but is that huge increase in government borrowing. That could push up interest rates for everyone.
Crowding out private investment.
Potentially, yeah. If the government is borrowing so much, it makes borrowing more expensive for businesses and individuals, which could cancel out some of the positive incentive effects from the tax cuts themselves.
Unless federal spending gets cut drastically.
That's the caveat they mention. Significant spending cuts would be needed to avoid that pressure on interest rates. They also point out businesses relying heavily on debt might actually face higher effective tax rates because they lose the interest deduction.
So it's complex. Any upside overall?
Well, they do project that overall, the plan would lower what are called marginal effective tax rates, or METRs, basically making investment more attractive on the whole and reducing the tax system's bias towards debt over equity.
And what about take-home pay? How does it affect taxes on labor?
The effective marginal rates on labor income are projected to drop, on average by about 2 percentage points.
But is that drop even across the board?
No, it's not. The analysis indicates a much larger drop for the very top earners, over 7 percentage points for the top 0.1%.
Ah, okay. So that leads to the distributional question. Who benefits most, according to the TPC analysis?
Their analysis concludes the plan would disproportionately benefit higher income households.
Both in percentage terms and the total share of the tax change.
Yes, both in terms of the percentage boost to their after-tax income and the share of the total federal tax change they'd receive.
Okay, so we've got the public sentiment meeting expectations but deeply divided. And the tax plan, major revenue cuts, debt increases, potential economic shifts, and distributional effects favoring higher incomes.
Right.
Let's broaden out now. Look at the wider context using those other sources.
Right, because none of this happens in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Thinking about President Trump's overall approach,
Yeah.
his communication style is obviously a huge factor. Sources like the White House Historical Association point to that direct-to-public method via social media, especially Twitter in the past,
Yeah.
bypassing traditional media.
Yeah, that's definitely a defining feature. And his core policy goals, looking back at the first term, places like the Miller Center and Pew Research highlight consistent themes, right?
Absolutely. Tax reform, which we just discussed,
Yeah.
deregulation, those protectionist trade policies, immigration control, a big one,
Yeah.
and of course, judicial appointments. These seem like reliable guides for his second-term focus, too.
And those partisan divides we saw in the poll, Pew Research really digs into how deep that goes, doesn't it?
It really does. It's not just approval ratings. It affects how people see his character, even whether they can agree on, basic facts. And Rutgers University links this environment to falling trust in news media, especially along party lines, driven partly by longer trends, too, like media deregulation.
There are also those broader concerns mentioned about democratic institutions themselves.
Yes, Pew noted that. A significant number of people expressing concern about the questioning of the legitimacy of democratic processes and institutions. That's a worrying undercurrent.
Definitely. Now, specifically on immigration, the ACLU analysis laid out some potential directions. What did they highlight?
Their analysis points to a potential strong focus on increasing mass deportations. Also, possible attempts to challenge birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment standard.
Which would face huge legal hurdles, presumably. Cases like Plyler v. Doe come to mind.
Exactly. Major legal battles, likely. The ACLU also anticipates potential renewed efforts at family separation at the border, despite that Mrs. LVICE settlement trying to prevent it. Plus, moves to dismantle the asylum system and further militarize the border.
So, a very significant potential shift in immigration policy outlined there. What about internationally, U.S.-Russia relations?
The BBC analysis described that relationship under Trump as a roller coaster ride. Very unpredictable. Shifting stances, potential for cooperation one minute and tension the next.
A volatile dynamic.
Very much so. And just as context, Forbes tracks his net worth, reminding us of that extensive business background he brings to the presidency.
Right. And finally, the legal side. Wikipedia notes his history of legal challenges, doesn't it?
Lawsuits related to his businesses over the years, controversies around social media bans, challenges to election results. These legal issues have been a recurring theme and could continue to play a role.
So all these wider factors, communication, past policies, divisions, institutional questions, specific policy directions like immigration, international relations, his background, legal issues, they all form the backdrop for the public opinion and economic plans we discussed.
Exactly. They're all interwoven. You can't really understand one without considering the others.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together as we wrap up. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, first, public opinion. The AP NORC poll suggests many feel the second term is meeting their expectations. But the country is incredibly divided on whether that's good or bad and on the administration's priorities.
Deep partisan splits remain the dominant feature there.
Definitely. Second, the tax plan analysis from the Tax Policy Center. It points towards really significant cuts in federal revenue, a substantial rise in the national debt.
And distributional effects that, according to their analysis, heavily favor higher-income households.
And third, the wider context. We see a lot of continuity from the first term, the communication style, the focus on certain policy areas like deregulation and immigration, and that persistent deep partisan polarization.
But also the potential for some really significant policy shifts, particularly based on that ACLU analysis of immigration.
Right, so putting all these pieces together from the sources you provided, that was the goal, to give you, the listener, a clearer, more synthesized picture of these complex dynamics, going beyond just the headlines.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. The poll suggests public expectations are largely aligning with the reality of these first 100 days. What does that tell us about our current political landscape?
Yeah.
But how we form expectations of leaders now?
And maybe also, how might those projected economic shifts from the tax plan, the debt, the distributional effects, how might those interact with the deep partisan divides in public sentiment we're seeing? Something to keep an eye on in the years ahead.